There's a millennial individual sitting at a desk at 11:47 p.m. On a Thursday night, the promotion letter is open on the screen. The salary number is there in black and white, larger than it was 12 months ago. The inbox is full of congratulations. A colleague wrote, "You absolutely deserve this." Another one wrote, "Inspiring." A third person used the word "crushing it." The millennial individual reads every single message and then sits very still, not because something went wrong, because everything went right. And somehow, in the specific silence of that moment, the chest does not fill with the warmth that was supposed to be there. There is something else instead. Something quieter. Something that does not have a name yet, but has been living in the background for a long time. Like a tab that never gets closed. This is not a crisis. This is not ingratitude. This is not a character flaw. This is what happens when an entire generation was handed a very specific instruction manual for life and followed it perfectly, and arrived at the destination and found the destination strangely, quietly hollow. The Millennial, the millennial individual, did not write this manual. They received it. It arrived through the voices of parents who watched economies collapse and rebuilt themselves through sheer effort. It arrived through school counselors who handed out college brochures like maps to a promised land. It arrived through every movie, every after-school special, every motivational poster on every classroom wall that said, in slightly different words, the same single sentence, "Work hard enough, and you will earn the life you want." And the millennial individual believed it. Not naively, not blindly. They believed it because the evidence at first seemed to support it. Grades went up when they studied harder. Teams responded when they worked longer. Bosses noticed when they stayed late. The manual appeared to be accurate. So they kept following it. What the manual did not account for was the year 2008. The millennial individual who graduated between 2007 and 2012 walked out of universities holding degrees that had cost them, in many cases, 6 figures of debt into an economy that had just swallowed itself whole. Entry-level positions evaporated. Internships became the new entry-level. Unpaid internships became the new internships. The promised land was still visible on the horizon, but the road to it had been washed out and nobody seemed to be fixing it. And the millennial individual was standing at the edge of that gap holding a map that no longer matched the territory. What did they do? They worked harder. They updated the resume. They took the unpaid internship. They moved back home if they had to, quietly, without making it mean something permanent. They added skills. They got certified. They networked. They hustled, and that word hustle was not yet the cultural monument it would become, but the behavior was already there, already built into the architecture of how they moved through the world. The manual said, "Work harder." So they worked harder, and slowly, in ways they did not fully notice while it was happening. The working became the identity. The architecture of achievement. There is a specific thing that happens inside a person when the external world consistently rewards effort with outcome. The brain begins to draw a very clean line between the two. Effort leads to outcome. Outcome leads to worth. Worth leads to safety. The millennial individual did not decide to tie their self-worth to their productivity. That wiring happened gradually. Through repetition, through reinforcement, through a decade of navigating an economy that kept moving the finish line and a culture that kept applauding the running. By the time the millennial individual is 33, 35, 37, they do not experience rest as rest. They experience rest as a temporary state between productive periods. A Sunday afternoon that contains no measurable output does not feel like recovery. It feels like falling behind. The body is on the couch. The mind is composing an email it will send Monday morning. This is not laziness in reverse. This is not ambition. This is the nervous system of someone who learned very early that stillness was not safe, because in the years when the economy was unreliable, when the job market was unpredictable, when the path that was supposed to be clear kept disappearing, stopping meant being left behind. Stopping meant someone else got the position. Stopping meant the gap widened. Stopping for the millennial individual who came of age in that specific climate was a risk they could not afford. And the brain remembers that. Long after the immediate danger has passed. Long after the job is stable and the bills are paid and the promotion letter is sitting open on the screen. At 11:47 p.m., the brain still runs the old program. Still flags stillness as danger. Still reaches for the next task before the current one is fully finished. On a Sunday evening, the millennial individual opens the laptop. Not because there is work to do. Because the silence feels like guilt. What hustle culture did and did not PRO as around 2015. Something interesting happened to the behavior the millennial individual had been quietly practicing for years. It got a name. It got an aesthetic. It got merchandise. Hustle culture arrived as a celebration of everything the millennial individual had already been doing out of necessity, repackaged as a philosophy, a personality, a badge of honor. The 5 a.m. wake-up. The side hustle. The grind. The idea that sleep was for people who lacked vision and that the gap between where you were and where you wanted to be could always be closed by working harder and wanting it more. The millennial individual did not invent this, but they recognized it. It sounded like the manual. It sounded like the voice that had been running in the background since 2008. It sounded almost exactly like the internal logic they had been operating on for a decade. So many of them leaned in, and here's what hustle culture promised. Explicitly and implicitly, that the output would eventually match the input. That if the millennial individual gave enough hours, enough energy, enough of their 30s, the life on the other side would feel as large and full and meaningful as the sacrifice had been. Here is what hustle culture did not mention. The hedonic treadmill. The hedonic treadmill is a psychological phenomenon. It describes the observed tendency of human beings to return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive or negative events or life changes. In simpler terms, the brain adapts. The promotion that felt like a destination becomes, within weeks, the new baseline. The salary increase that was supposed to change everything becomes the number that normal is measured from. The achievement that was going to make it all worth it becomes the floor of the next set of expectations. The millennial individual runs. The treadmill moves. The scenery does not change, and nobody put that in the manual. The specific exhaustion of arrive iron, there is a particular kind of tired. That does not come from working too much. It comes from achieving the thing, the actual thing, the one that was supposed to matter, and finding that the feeling on the other side is quieter and shorter than expected. The millennial individual who lands the role, closes the deal, hits the number, finishes the degree, gets the apartment, reaches the milestone, that individual often experiences something that sits in the awkward space between relief and flatness. Not depression, not failure, just a strange, slightly disorienting absence of the feeling that was supposed to be there. Psychologists have a clinical term for this. Post-achievement depression is recognized as a real response pattern, a drop in mood and motivation that occurs after a significant goal has been reached. The brain, which had organized itself around the pursuit, suddenly loses the organizing principle. The dopamine that fueled the chase disappears. The structure that made every day legible, work toward the thing, get closer to the thing, protect the thing, dissolves. And the millennial individual looks around at the evidence of everything they have built and feels. quietly and without fully understanding why. A little bit lost. They do not talk about this much. The culture does not have good language for it. Gratitude is offered as a solution. Perspective is suggested. Someone, inevitably, mentions people who have it worse. The millennial individual nods, adjusts the expression, opens the laptop and starts building the next thing to run toward, because motion, at least, is familiar. What gets left behind you when the working becomes the identity? Certain things quietly leave the room. Friendships that require time without an agenda. Hobbies that produce nothing measurable. Afternoons that are not optimized for anything. The version of the self that existed before the first resume was written. The person who wanted things for reasons that had nothing to do with career, trajectory, or LinkedIn visibility, or the 5-year plan. The millennial individual does not notice these departures in real time. The losses are gradual. A friendship that drifts because both people are busy. A creative interest that gets postponed until the next quiet period that never arrives. A version of joy that requires doing something completely useless for an entire afternoon. And the growing inability to do that without. The productivity guilt creeping in at the edges. At 36, the millennial individual cannot remember the last time they did something purely because it felt good and produced nothing. They think about this occasionally, usually late at night, usually after checking the email one final time before sleep. The thought arrives and then gets filed under things to address later, when things slow down, when the next milestone is reached. When there's finally time. There's always a next milestone. There is never finally time. The part nobody prepares you for here is the thing about a generation that was told the formula was real. When the formula works, when the effort does eventually produce the outcome, there's nobody in the room to explain why arriving does not feel like arriving. The millennial individual followed the instructions. They got the result. They are, by every measurable external standard, doing well. The life, from the outside, looks like evidence that the manual was correct. And maybe it was correct. Maybe the manual got them here to this desk, to this salary, to this title. Maybe without it, the situation would be materially worse. That is probably true. But the manual said nothing about what happens to the person inside the achievement. It said nothing about the identity that forms around constant motion. It said nothing about the cost of spending the most generative years of adulthood running a program that was designed for survival and calling it a life. The millennial individual is not broken. They are not ungrateful. They are not failing to appreciate what they have. They are simply experiencing, for the first time, the gap between a life that looks right and a life that feels right. And they are discovering quietly at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday that those two things are not always the same address. The beginning of something else here is what the millennial individual is not being told often enough. The exhaustion is not a weakness. The emptiness after the achievement is not ingratitude. The inability to rest without guilt is not a character flaw. These are the entirely predictable outcomes of being shaped by a specific set of forces, economic, cultural, generational, that optimize for output and forgot to account for the human being producing it. Recognizing the pattern is not the same as dismantling it overnight. The wiring does not change because someone explained where it came from. But something shifts when the pattern gets named. Something small but real. The program does not disappear. But for the first time, the millennial individual can see the program running. Can notice the moment the laptop opens on a Sunday evening, not because there is something to do, but because the stillness felt dangerous. Can catch the reflex before the reflex catches them. That noticing, quiet, private, unglamorous is where something new begins. Not a reinvention. Not a pivot. Not a personal brand built around the recovery, just a person at a desk at 11:47 p.m. reading the congratulations messages one more time, and then, for the first time in a long time, closing the laptop without opening anything else. Sitting in the silence, not fixing it. Not filling it. Just letting it be there. That is not emptiness anymore. That is space. And space, for a generation that was never given any, is where everything that was left behind gets a chance to come back. The millennial individual does not need to earn the right to feel that. They already have. Thanks for watching. If this felt familiar, leave a comment below. You are not the only one sitting at that desk.